The Young and the Restless Spoilers. People believed that the wedding of Danny and Christine would be the highlight of the year in Genoa City, a long-awaited moment of peace, forgiveness, and second chances. For weeks, the entire town buzzed with excitement, everyone certain that this time, after decades of detours, heartbreak, and reconciliation, Danny and Christine would finally get the happy ending fate had repeatedly stolen from them. But the truth was that appearances, as always in this world, were nothing more than fragile illusions stretched thin over tensions, resentments, and secrets that refused to stay buried. Everyone assumed that the only real threat to the ceremony was Phyllis, whose reputation for chaos preceded her, and who made no attempt to hide her disdain for the wedding. She tried everything. Snide comments, subtle sabotage, emotional appeals, desperate attempts to convince Danny that Christine wasn't right for him, but none of her actions carried the weight they once did. People had learned to tune her out. They treated her warnings as the usual bitterness, the usual storm that came every time she felt someone slipping out of her control. Even Daniel and Summer avoided her gaze whenever she started ranting about Christine's so-called true nature, because to them, it sounded like the same history repeating itself. In their eyes, Phyllis was simply being Phyllis, dramatic, possessive, and unable to let go. None of them imagined she might actually be right about something, or that the real danger wasn't coming from her at all. The true disruption, the one that would explode this perfect wedding fantasy, came from a place no one had expected, a name that had long faded into the emotional archives of the family. It came from someone Danny cherished deeply, someone whose return would hit him harder than any confrontation with Phyllis ever could. It came from Lucy, Daniel's daughter, the girl who had quietly disappeared from town after her mother's tragic death, leaving Genoa City behind as she struggled to rebuild her life away from the shadows of the past. The storyline that wrote her out of the canvas had been dramatic and heartbreaking, but in truth, the emotional scar it left on her family never fully healed. Danny often spoke of her with that soft ache in his voice, the nostalgic love of a grandfather who missed her kindness, her innocence, the light she used to bring into his life. Everyone assumed she was still somewhere far away, building a quieter, simpler existence. No one predicted that she would become the center of a storm that would rip open the truth in front of an entire congregation. Her return did not come from sentiment, nostalgia, or a desire to reconcile. It began with a moment. Sudden, unexpected, and disturbing, that shattered whatever peaceful distance she thought she had achieved. Lucy stumbled upon something she should never have seen, evidence connected to the darker side of Christine's past, choices Christine made long ago, decisions that were buried so carefully that even Danny, with all his history with her, had no idea how far she once went. To Lucy, these weren't mere mistakes. They were violations that went against everything she believed her grandfather deserved. Christine wasn't just flawed, everyone was flawed, but what Lucy discovered went beyond human imperfection. It carried the weight of manipulation, suppression, and a kind of moral arrogance that terrified her. The thought of Christine marrying Danny, intertwining her life permanently with his, became unbearable, almost nauseating, a betrayal of the grandfather she adored. She tried convincing herself that she shouldn't get involved, that coming back to town after so long, stirring up pain, disrupting a wedding, would only cause chaos. But then she remembered Danny's voice, the way he always called her sweetheart, the way he held her when her mother died, the way he promised her that even when people disappoint you, you must still stand up for the truth. It was that memory, that quiet moral compass he unknowingly placed inside her, that drove her to make the decision she dreaded but knew she couldn't avoid. She returned to Genoa City without warning, without calling Daniel, without telling anyone her purpose. She carried a letter Danny had written years ago and tucked it beside the evidence she gathered, proof she knew would shatter him but save him at the same time. When the wedding day arrived, Danny looked radiant with hope, Christine glowed with victory disguised as happiness, and the entire room melted into the romantic fantasy they wanted to believe. Even Phyllis stood in the back, arms crossed, jaw tight, realizing she had lost. Not Danny, she had accepted that part, but the chance to reveal the truth before it was too late. No one listened to her, and she had grown quiet, the rarest kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable. Yet, even in her silence, she never imagined that someone else had picked up the torch of destruction she had dropped. The ceremony began smoothly, almost too smoothly. Danny's hands were steady, Christine's smile unbreakable. The minister began the vows, guests leaned forward in anticipation, and even the air felt still, pressed between hope and inevitability. Then, just as Danny inhaled to speak, a piercing voice shattered the sanctity of the moment. "Stop." Lucy's voice echoed through the hall like glass breaking. Heads whipped around, gasps rippled through the guests, and Christine's expression collapsed from serenity into shock. Danny froze, confusion flooding his face as he recognized the figure standing in the doorway, his granddaughter, trembling, breathless, eyes burning with a mixture of fear and determination. Lucy stepped forward, every pair of eyes tracking her like a spotlight had been placed on her trembling silhouette. She didn't apologize for the interruption. She didn't hesitate. She said only what she had come to say, that this wedding could not continue. Christine tried to speak, her voice shaking, but Lucy raised a hand, silencing her with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She reached into her coat, pulled out a folded letter, and extended it toward Danny. It was the letter he once wrote to her mother, a letter filled with lessons about truth, integrity, and courage. Words Lucy now used to justify her intrusion. Danny's fingers trembled as he unfolded it, but before he could read, Lucy added the words that cut Christine deeper than any accusation could. "You taught me that love should never be built on lies." Christine's face drained of color. Phyllis straightened, suddenly alert, like a predator sensing blood in the water. Daniel stared at his daughter, unable to process what she was doing. And then Danny began to read. The letter slipped into his hands like a ghost returning to haunt the living. But tucked inside were papers, documents, transcripts, reports, the evidence Lucy had uncovered of Christine's past actions, the decisions she made that had been concealed under legal technicalities and selective memory. As Danny read, his expression transformed in slow, horrifying stages: confusion, disbelief, hurt, betrayal. His voice cracked as he reached the final page, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Christine tried to defend herself, stumbling through explanations that sounded weak and fragmented. But it was too late. Danny wasn't listening. The weight of the truth crushed the altar between them. He pressed his forehead into his hands, unable to reconcile the woman he loved with the actions documented before him. The ceremony dissolved into panic, guests whispering, Christine shaking, Lucy staring at the floor as tears threatened to spill. She had not come to destroy him, only to protect him, but the look on Danny's face made her wonder whether she had done both at once. The perfect wedding was over. The illusion was gone. And in its place stood a raw, brutal truth. The person everyone assumed would wreck the ceremony, Phyllis, was never the real threat. The true storm came from the one person Danny least expected, the one heart he trusted most, the one voice Christine could never silence. Lucy. And nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same after this moment. Christine's scream tore through the room with a desperation that felt almost feral, a raw burst of anguish that made every guest flinch as if struck. Tears poured down her face in thick, uncontrollable streams as she stepped forward, trembling, her voice cracking under the weight of a dream slipping out of her grasp, begging the universe, the crowd, Danny, anyone, to make this unraveling stop. Be quiet. Stop it. Please. Please just let this wedding happen, she cried, reaching out as if she could physically pull the moment back into her hands, as though by sheer force of will she could silence the truth Lucy had unleashed. Her sobs intensified, echoing through the hall, shattering whatever composure she had tried to maintain, and the words tumbled out in frantic waves. This is my dream wedding, my dream. Why does everyone want to destroy it? Why can't anyone let me be happy, just this once? The pain in her voice was so piercing that for a brief second the entire room froze, suspended between sympathy and suspicion, between understanding her heartbreak and recognizing the terror behind her reaction. But the damage was already spiraling beyond her control, because Danny, who had always been her anchor, her history, her safe place, was no longer looking at her with love or certainty. His eyes, foggy and wounded, kept drifting back to Lucy's face, to the papers in his hand, to the truth he had tried so hard not to see. His chest rose and fell as if he couldn't catch his breath, like each second was adding another stone to the weight crushing his heart. Lucy stood there silently, tears in her eyes but her expression unwavering, and Danny felt something shift inside him, something frightening, unfamiliar, and undeniable. Christine's cries filled the air, but Lucy's truth, soft, steady, unflinching, echoed louder inside his chest. He wanted to believe Christine, wanted to reach for her and erase the confusion, but every word she screamed only amplified the cracks forming in the foundation of their trust. His hands trembled as he lowered the papers, his gaze unsettled, flicking between the woman he loved and the granddaughter who had never lied to him. And in that split second, Christine saw it, saw the precise moment the ground beneath her collapsed. The disbelief in Danny's eyes, the uncertainty tightening his jaw, the silent plea for answers she could not provide without unraveling herself completely. She staggered backward, as if struck by a force she couldn't see, and a hollow, pained laugh slipped from her lips, twisted with exhaustion, fear, and betrayal. Christine felt everything collapsing at once. The judgment in the room, the whispers rising like smoke, the humiliation searing her skin, the love she thought she finally reclaimed slipping through her fingers again. She hated Lucy in that moment, hated Phyllis for being right for once in her life, hated Daniel for standing frozen, hated Danny for hesitating. But what terrified her most was how much she hated herself for letting her past become the executioner of her present. Her shoulders shook violently as she cried harder, the kind of hopeless crying that came from years of fighting, sacrificing, clawing her way through adversity, only to have fate rip away her happiness once again. She pressed her hands to her face, choking on sobs, whispering broken pleas. What am I supposed to do? What do you want from me? How do I fix this? But no one answered. No one stepped forward. Not even Danny. The silence around her became suffocating, a wall of judgment and pity closing in until she felt trapped inside a nightmare she could no longer outrun. Her dream wedding, the one she had imagined since she was young, the one she believed she finally deserved, was collapsing in slow motion before her eyes, and the man she loved stood paralyzed, torn between truth and loyalty, between who she once was and who she had become. And as Christine looked at Danny, desperation twisting through her like barbed wire, she realized with heartbreaking clarity that her tears were no longer saving her, they were drowning her. Because nothing was more terrifying than watching the person you love begin to doubt you, and nothing was more painful than knowing that no matter how loud you screamed, you could not stop the truth from swallowing the future you had built your entire heart around. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment, unable to fully process what had just happened, as if the world had tilted on its axis and left him stranded in a reality he no longer recognized. The shock rippled through him so violently that it felt like his ribs might crack from the pressure, and all he could hear was the echo of Lucy's voice, his daughter's voice, still hanging in the air like the final strike of a bell that refused to fade. The chaos around him blurred into a distant, muffled roar. Christine's sobs, Phyllis whispering sharp disbelief, the guests murmuring with rising panic, and Danny's shaky breaths as he clutched those damning papers. But Daniel's entire being narrowed into one point, Lucy standing in the center of the destroyed ceremony, trembling but resolute, a flicker of pain and defiance burning behind her tear-bright eyes. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another, his heartbeat pounding so violently he could feel it echo in his skull. Part of him wanted to grab her, pull her into a hug, protect her from the tidal wave she had just unleashed. Another part wanted to shake her, demand answers, beg her to understand the consequences of what she had done. But beneath all of that, buried in a place he didn't want to look at, was a deeper fear, because some part of him already knew that Lucy would never have come here, never have returned after all this time, unless she had been pushed to a breaking point. Unless something was horribly, irrevocably true. Lucy, he finally said, his voice low and rough, barely audible over the noise around them. She turned toward him, her chin trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. Her lips parted as if she wanted to explain, but Daniel's expression, pained, confused, betrayed, made her words collapse before they could form. He stopped just a few feet from her, unsure of how to bridge the growing distance between them, even though they were close enough to touch. "What did you do?" he whispered, not with anger, but with a softness so fragile it threatened to break. Why would you come back like this? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me? Why, here?" The last word cracked, splitting open something raw inside him, because he realized he didn't even know his daughter anymore. Not really, not the version of her that had endured her mother's death, not the version that had grown up away from Genoa City and its ghosts. Lucy swallowed hard, her hands clenched at her sides, her entire body taut with emotion. "Because you wouldn't have listened," she said softly, her voice shaking. "You would have told me to stay out of it. You would have said it wasn't my place. You would have protected Christine. You always protect everyone, except yourself." Her breathing hitched, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her trembling hand. "And I wasn't going to let Grandpa walk into something he didn't understand. Not again. Not after everything we've already lost." Her words hit Daniel like a punch to the chest, because beneath the accusation, beneath the fire, there was the unmistakable sound of a child who still loved her family too much, who carried wounds she kept hidden under layers of independence and distance. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "Lucy, you don't understand what you've done. You didn't just expose something, you blew apart a wedding. You hurt people. You blindsided Grandpa. You blindsided me." His eyes flicked briefly to Danny, who still sat in stunned silence, crushed by the weight of revelation. "You lit a match in a room full of gasoline." Lucy's jaw tightened, and for a moment, her eyes hardened with an adult resolve that startled him. "Sometimes things need to burn," she said, her voice steadier than before. "Sometimes the truth has to destroy something before it can save anyone." Daniel felt something inside him crumble, pride, heartbreak, fear, because she sounded so much like her mother in that moment, fierce and wounded, determined to protect the people she loved no matter the cost. He reached out, gently placing his hands on her shoulders, and she didn't pull away, though her body trembled under his touch. "Lucy, talk to me," he whispered, searching her face. "Tell me what you found. Tell me why you thought this was the only way." She looked up at him, her voice barely audible as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Because I didn't want to lose him," she said. "And I didn't want us to lose each other again. I didn't want us to lose everything all over again." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daniel felt his chest tighten so painfully he thought he might collapse under the weight of it. The room around them had fallen eerily quiet, suspended on the precipice of tragedy and truth. Christine watched them through her tears, trembling with heartbreak and fury. Danny looked at Lucy with shattered disbelief. Phyllis stared at the scene with a mixture of vindication and awe. And the guests whispered as if witnessing the unraveling of an entire family at its core. Daniel swallowed hard, pulling Lucy into his arms at last, holding her tightly as though he feared she might vanish again if he loosened his grip. And for the first time since the ceremony had detonated, Lucy let herself collapse into him, clutching the fabric of his suit, sobbing into his chest. Not out of regret for what she'd done, but out of exhaustion, fear, and the weight of a truth she had carried alone for far too long. "Okay," Daniel whispered into her hair, his voice trembling. "Okay. I've got you. We'll figure this out. Just stay with me this time. Don't disappear again. We face this together. Whatever happens next, we face it as a family." But as he held her, he knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, in Genoa City would ever be the same again.